Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled here at Google, at our talks at Google, to welcome folks from the Detroit, Denmark conversation. Our amazing panelists here are going to speak to us a little bit about the changes, the similarities in the cities and the opportunity of design, specifically around empowering urban communities through design. I'll let our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start with Kathrin.
Yes. My name is Kathrin. I'm part of Yaya Architects, which is a small design studio based in Copenhagen. We work with planning, architecture, and urban spaces. And as we just talked about before, I'm actually original Swiss and grew up in Switzerland, but came to Denmark some 10, 15 years ago and kind of fell in love with the way architecture and design is worked with in Copenhagen. And until I'm today sitting here with Consul General Anne and representing the Danish side of this talk.
Which is absolutely lovely, having a Swiss falling in love with Denmark. I just noticed I must have changed hair colors. But there you go, miracles do exist. So I'm the Consul General of Denmark in New York. I've been there for the last 4 years. Before that, I was in Paris as ambassador, and before that, I worked with Europe in all kinds of ways. I'm actually a European Union nerd who got a bit depressed about Europe, so that's why I went over here. And now I'm very optimistic about Europe, so when I go back, who knows? But being in New York and working in this great country has brought me so many things, and one of the things is to work outside New York and to meet somebody like Kimberly, who is a rock star, everybody knows it, and to have relationships, corporations with cities. Countries are important, but cities are perhaps the things that can save us in the end. And Denmark is a nice size in the way of working together with huge American cities or important American cities like Detroit.
I'm Olga Stella. I'm the Executive Director of Design Corps Detroit, and we're an advocacy organization for the design industries in Detroit and the region. We put on Detroit Month of Design, which is right now, all month of September. There are 55 events. There's something for everyone. You can find it on DetroitMonthOfDesign.com. I'm constantly selling in the month of September. But my background is in community and economic development. I've lived in the city for 20 years. I've worked primarily in the public sector, public and nonprofit sector, since 1999 here in the city, and just really have seen both. Primarily worked kind of more in business attraction and real estate development and community development prior to coming to Design Corps. And now I'm on the other side of really trying to figure out how do we help Detroit-based businesses and Detroiters build a larger market for Detroit design, not just locally, but worldwide.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kimberly Driggins, and I'm with the City of Detroit's Planning and Development Department. Been with the city for 3 years, and I have intersected with Olga and just about everybody on the panel, actually. So it feels good to be here. And my focus has been really thinking about how arts and culture and design can help drive and revitalize our neighborhoods. In particular, have had a really sort of special relationship with Denmark and Copenhagen in particular. And another role that I have, I'm the chair of Gale Institute, which is Yen Gale, who's really the architect of cities for people, and that has been our strategy in the city of Detroit for how we think about space and making sure that our public spaces and our streets are really have a human-centered design and are putting people first. In everything that we do. So have been to Copenhagen 2 or 3 times over the last year, have developed relationships with folks on the panel, and really have been Olga's complement on the city side with respect to a design strategy and really thinking about inclusive design for all Detroiters, and we'll get into that as Seth kicks off the Q&A.
With that, so some of you may be asking, Detroit, Copenhagen, how do these things, what's the commonality? They're actually about a similar size, about 700,000 or so, despite that one city is 300 years old, Detroit, and the other is 1,000 years old. But as both have approached or skated near bankruptcy, both have emerged as these centers for design and inspiration driven through arts and education, and specifically talking about the empowerment of what that design can do for the community. I think as Kimberly's kind of touching on in terms of, well, what's the role of mobility? What's the role of education? What's the role of sustainability? And how do we create these spaces that ultimately become more functioning and productive and healthy and happy cities? So with that, we'll get into some of our questions. We've got a few, but I would ask the folks in the audience that are here that if you have a burning question, because I know some of you are super interested, please hold it. We'll get to that at the end, and we'll go through it. I'll be curious to hear that. But what I'd love to kick off with is, Kimberly, you had mentioned public spaces, which we talked a little bit about in the background, which is probably my favorite discussion in terms of the role that architecture or space plays in the public and bring us together as community. But how has Detroit reimagined and repurposed some of these public spaces, like specifically, and how is that helping revitalize different centers? Like, can you give us some examples of that in Detroit?
Sure.
Or Olga?
Yep, I'm going to rely on Olga to help me out here. So we're in a really dynamic time in the city of Detroit. There's a lot of planning and design work going on, and not just downtown, not just in the 7.2, but in our neighborhoods. Several of you have probably, we have public space treasures like the waterfront and Belle Isle and DeQuinder Cut and Campus Martius. Those are, I think, the ones that a lot of people are familiar with, but we're also revitalizing public space and parks in our neighborhoods as well. And it really is about getting people out and interacting and really feeling comfortable in public space. I think that the city, for decades, folks were not out in public space the way that you would see in other cities like Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., or even New York. And it really is about making sure that the spaces feel inclusive for all Detroiters. I think that when I go out on the waterfront, which is one of my favorite public spaces in the city of Detroit, it feels like Detroit. It's representative of the demographics of the city, and that's what I really like about the space. Not all of our spaces feel that welcoming to everyone, and that's part of my charge. I take that responsibility very seriously around inclusive design, and some of the new spaces, such as Spirit Plaza, it's actually under construction right now. That was a temporary public space right in front of City Hall that was really promoted to be the civic space where Detroiters could protest, come together, picnic, and just do large-scale events. And I'm happy to see that project actually move from temporary to permanent over the last 2 years. I'll let Olga weigh in on some of the other spaces.
Yeah, I think to pick up on Kimberly's comment about what makes a great space in Detroit great is whether or not it's welcoming. And you see that, I think, historically in a place like Eastern Market, who until recently has seen a lot more investment. It's kind of cleaned up some of the frayed edges, but continues to really attract a diversity of people who are coming for all kinds of reasons. And I think you look at a space like Eastern Market, and there's something for everyone. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be poor. You can come on public transit. You can ride your own car. You can come on a bicycle. There's enough of a mix there, and then it continues to be. And it's under threat right now due to private development. But the kind of the public function of the space, both the city and the nonprofit organization and the community really support it. And I think that is a great example of where protecting a public space like that and its and how it welcomes Detroiters of all backgrounds is really the challenge going forward. I think about a place like Clark Park in Southwest Detroit, which hasn't seen a great amount of investment. In fact, the city abandoned the park over 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago, and the community took it over. And that community running the park, the ownership of the park, it has the only outdoor hockey program in the city, with the NHL. There's a lot. It serves as a center point of an extremely diverse immigrant community. And the place like that, actually, what it needs the city's infrastructure investment, and it's coming. But I think it's how do you preserve there, and in a place like that, the community really took ownership and was able to develop the kinds of programming and spaces that then responded back to that diversity in the community. And I think that's going to be the challenge, is preserving that as more and more investment comes into the city.
And if you can just speak to, we talked a bit about the Dane approach to egalitarianism in these spaces and the role of creating it. And I think, as Olga mentions, that the city's responsibility to help continue to maintain. Are there any examples you can give us from Copenhagen where these parks or spaces, can get off the parks, and have been reimagined to sort of support that?
Yeah, thank you, and also thank you for hosting this conversation. It's really appreciated. I was just reflecting about the same things when I heard the answers, because a lot of the problems we share, and some we don't. So accessibility and to be able to make sure that the public has ownership is rarely the problem in Denmark. There it's a given, and you can privatize some, but definitely not something like a waterfront or even access to beaches or parks. So in that way we are very different. And another example, and you know that when you have traveled to Europe, and perhaps especially to Northern Europe, that pedestrians have a huge space. I'm not even talking about cyclists, we'll come to them. but before cyclists, pedestrians owned the streets and still do. And in many cities or places even in America, you don't have that.
Right.
And you feel that the city is not only yours, you need to have a car, and understood is you need to have the money for a car to really to have access to the public life there. And there is a difference in the way we construct societies and cities.
So this is where we start to go off script, because you just hit on my favorite topic of Detroit, which is around transportation, right? And the implications of transportation and things like this expressway that cuts off our access to the Fox Theater until the bridge is built. What are some of the challenges that we see in terms of not just transportation, but other elements that are not factored into when designing? Like, what are the mistakes that we make when designing for communities? And we don't think about, like, oh, if I put the expressway there, how do people get to the waterfront? Or if I, take away the cars and, then everyone has to get on a bus, or we lose that access. And I think it's a fascinating topic specifically for Detroit, but it's interesting to hear the Dane, the European point of view as well, where it is much more pedestrian friendly.
Yeah, and if I can just, because of course many much more relevant answers from my friends from Detroit, but just to make sure that we all know that Danes are not saints, and in Copenhagen for sure not. And Kathrin knows that much better than I do even. But 60s, during the 1960s, the 1970s, we were just as if Robert Moses was living in Copenhagen, really, really good at mucking up the city by constructing throughways through the most beautiful parts and making the city not work. So it's not as if we haven't gone there. And what stopped us was what also was the start of the Danish really paradigm shift into thinking about environment and climate, was a wonderful international crisis in 1973, the oil crisis. And what did it do? Literally, it stopped us, because cars were not allowed to drive during Sundays through several months. And looking at the cities and our communities in a different way woke us up. What does it mean suddenly to own your own cities? What does it mean that there is a limit to growth? What does it mean that you can't take resources for given? And then city planners and brilliant architects came and saved the day. But so we were sinners, big sinners, wake up call, and here you go.
Right, excellent. To that point, Kimberly, on transportation, I'll point to you from the city in terms of part of the revitalization we have with these bike lanes, right? And this is very tense discussions with people that commute in and out of the city. But I think for some of us, there's a great debate that this is actually what's starting to bring us together and create more of a pedestrian feel and get us more connected to the city. How is the city thinking about further bike lanes? Is this a new mode of transportation or public transportation more broadly, like getting beyond the automotive?
Right. So, transportation in Detroit, I mean, and I would just say the highways, I mean, that is throughout the U.S. I mean, that's just the history of urbanization, suburbanization, and then, kind of going back to what worked before we had this kind of proliferation of highways. And I would say that's where urban planning is today in the US, is sort of going back to what worked, in the early 20th century before you had this sort of explosion. And Detroit, it's taken longer because it's the motor city, and the DNA of the automobile and what that means for this city. I mean, it's part of the DNA. But I will say that, in the last several years, there's been a lot of strides to make Detroit multimodal. Bike lanes it's interesting, they're actually controversial in every city. There are certain things that have become kind of code for gentrification and like a changing city and demographics, and bike lanes have kind of got caught up in that. I will say that the city has a broader transportation strategy. We're doing a master plan for transportation. Currently, we kicked that off a couple of weeks ago. Bike lanes, and I'll just say this, Detroiters have always ridden bikes. They've always been, I think the statistic is 30% of Detroiters don't own a vehicle. So that's pretty high in the motor city. So people have always been biking, but we also have the highest number of bike fatalities. And those people that are being killed are actually young African-American men. That's the highest number. So we see bike lanes as a public health response, and not just urban transportation and mobility, but it's actually saving lives. And also thinking, scooters are interesting. That's something that every city's dealing with too. We could do a whole conversation.
We'll have an off-the-record conversation about the scooters and how.
The key is to tie the mobility and provide access to residents and citizens that need it. And it's really about a connected city. And we think that multimodal is definitely the way to go. One of the reasons why the city lost the Amazon bid was around transportation, or the lack of a mobility plan. And I think that actually galvanized the region to actually rethink. And Olga can speak to this better than I can. I know that there have been attempts over the years, several, around creating a more pedestrian-friendly, multimodal Detroit, but it hasn't succeeded in the legislature. I think we're on the cusp of seeing political support for it. Certainly the city supports it, and I think that it's about choice. And when you think about the future, you think about millennials and the generation after them, it's really about choice and not necessarily needing a car. And we're really clear, and we know that those are the preferences, but we want to make sure that Detroiters have choice, that that they're safe and that they're protected.
I would just maybe take a slightly different take. I think part of the challenge is that people who've made the transportation decisions do it from their own lens. So they think about, what is it that I want? And if they're coming from a place of privilege, or they've grown up in a suburban environment, they're used to kind of door-to-door service in their car. They're used to everybody in their life having a car. They're used to maybe making one trip a day, right, to their office and back. And they take that framework, and that is the framework that they're using to make decisions. And when we think about the needs in the city, that is not the typical person who needs mobility in the city. And that's been part of, we've been doing some work with one of Kimberly's colleagues, Mark De Laverne, who's a chief mobility officer in the mayor's office, and he is, as they work with DDOT and they work to improve the relationships with the regional transit options, the discussion is really, there is no typical user. There's a diversity of people who need mobility in our city. There are people coming in, there are native Detroiters, there are people who are going out, there are tourists, there are all different kinds of people. And there is no typical user. And we have to throw away this idea of a typical user. And that is fundamentally what inclusive design is about. And so really working with Mark and his team, to work not just with industry, but also with community, and to start to get to see other kinds of users as the city develops the transit options. I think that, and then that advocacy, there's political change obviously happening, especially in Oakland County right now. That is, I think, those kinds of things together will start to create a different set of mobility options, especially because unlike in Denmark, we don't have policy to support us. And so this is really about kind of individual leaders elected and appointed trying to drive this. And I think some of this is about changing a mindset, not just about choice, but about who is it for.
So to that, I think the design decisions for inclusivity actually fall on architects and on designers and on community. And I think obviously inclusivity in transportation, that's something that we've spent a good deal of time talking about and we'll continue to talk about in Detroit. I'd love to ask you, Kathrin, to talk about a little bit about inclusivity in technology in developing a building, right? And how are we building our buildings and our structures and so forth that they are being equally inclusive, right? That we're not designing it only for some reason. I'm sure that's something you spend a good deal of time with.
Yes. Just to also get back on what you just said, I think because it's really a mix of strong policy making and then architects, planners, and their clients that rethink on how you can imagine life in the future and how our cities can apply for that. But then at the same time, it's also important that that the citizens are active and have a voice in how to develop that. And I think that's also what has to do with this, what you mentioned with or asked about inclusivity, that we do it in a way that kind of empowers people to take action on how we want to deal with our environmental problems and social problems that face our cities. Because if they are not part of it, it's all worthless. So I think, do it in a way that is open enough for many to develop it together, and it's like a collective effort rather than like a top-down or decision on how to do things.
Specifically in terms of technology, obviously we're at Google, right? Are there certain considerations that you have to take to make sure that what you're building is inclusive of technology, is that folks enter technology at different points in time, right? How does that work in terms of programming the building, if you will? Like, do you? Yeah,
we of course I think that the technological developments right now in automation and digitalization create great opportunities. But it's also important to kind of use them in a way where they actually make our surroundings better. So for example, if you take the car as an example, I mean, it could be that there's going to be suddenly many more cars clutching our cities and using space. So it's important that we combine it with a strategy on, okay, how should we use that automated car or move with it? So it's not just cars without people driving around, but that we actually can use this physical object to have more people traveling. And I think that it's important that you always think organization together with the actual design of the physical space. So we don't just go all in on kind of implementing for the demands that maybe the producer of a certain technology kind of says, but like that we actually try to think, okay, where do we want to go? How does our kind of future city life, how would we like to live? What is urbanity in the future? And how can we use technology to implement it?
Right.
So we kind of first decide and then we provide, and we don't provide along the way.
And that being thoughtful about what you want that future city life to be, and not to Olga's point of taking it from one lens or point of view, right? Making sure that is inclusive, because with the autonomous vehicle, it could be Robert Moses 2.0.
Exactly.
If we don't do that quite right. Fascinating. I think one other piece, which is really near and dear to this office here in Detroit, is we focus a lot on education and the role that technology can play in empowering education and kind of that next generation of Googlers and that next generation. What role does education play in urban renewal and building? In that consideration, we talk about transportation, we talk about buildings. Like, what's the role of education that you all see playing in this? Anyway.
So in the work that we've been doing with design businesses and really thinking about how do we position Detroit as a source of globally as a source of creative talent. I mean, really, the design industries are not very diverse. They're doing better in terms of gender, definitely not where they need to be in terms of race and ethnicity. And that, when we think about Detroit and our strength, it is the diversity of the communities who are here. So we have a coalition of 55 organizations, business and in community, that are working to develop Detroit as a center for inclusive design. And a big group of them, like probably 15, almost 20, are all working around youth development and in this education space. Because the creative talent that is innate in our kids, these young Detroiters are the generation of next designers who can create, the AI that's not racist, right? That can, program the autonomous vehicle in a way that maybe is going to take in a different set of considerations. And just one great example, there's a group of youth that are part of the Brightmoor Woodworkers program in Northwest Detroit. And they developed, because they were so inspired by and horrified by the Flint water crisis, they developed a water purification system, both to create, and there's a water crisis in Detroit as well. Many people in the city don't, because of poverty and other reasons and water shutoffs, don't have access to water. So they created a water purification system through the program, actually taking that purification system to Africa. And that's, they're not trained designers, they're not engineers, they're a bunch of kids in an after-school program. And that is just the kind of creativity that is innate in these kids. And when you start to think about how do we connect the dots between the education they're receiving every day, the career options, starting to help them, see what those opportunities are, helping their caregivers see those opportunities, that's how we're going to start to maybe break down some of the silos.
And what role, if any, does urban planning considerations take into account for the education? How do we create those spaces that encourage that sort of thinking and that expansive, is that a consideration that we do?
Kimberly answer that, I think one of the biggest problems that we have in Detroit is because of the bankruptcy and the crisis in our public schools that really is a result of lack of state support. We've shut down schools in neighborhoods, so there's no more. Basically, there's no such thing as like your neighborhood school. I mean, you kind of have it, but not really. So everybody is driving all over. When you couple that with the lack of mobility options, you've got parents or caregivers who are trying to get their kids to school, taking 2 sets of buses, commuting 2 hours just to get to school in the city. So that, to me, that's where urban planning can come in, is we need neighborhood schools again, and quality schools in every neighborhood in Detroit.
Completely agree with you. It's not the purview of planning and development, but I think, there should be, greater intentionality with the planning department and in the school system. The city that I come from, Washington, D.C., the schools were under mayoral control, so that allowed for greater integration and cross-fertilization with urban planning. We did a lot of the planning, and we did think through population projections. I'm talking about when I was in DC, we had a closer relationship with the school system. I'm not saying that, I think the relationship with the city and the school is really good, but it's just, there's just a lot of priorities. And what I will say with respect to urban planning and education and design, our office has really taken it upon ourselves to really think about the next generation and to really think about exposure to careers in urban planning and design at an early age. And we do try to engage youth when we do our neighborhood planning frameworks. There's usually a youth outreach component. We are driving actually a youth-centered neighborhood plan in the Cody Rouge Warrendale neighborhood right now. And that is really, we've learned so many amazing lessons through that planning process. This is something that's being funded by foundations in the area that really, that neighborhood, those neighborhoods actually have the highest concentration of youth in the city. And so there was an opportunity there when we were thinking about a neighborhood framework plan to really engage youth in a very meaningful way. And they are actually driving the plan. Like there's a youth council. We've worked with them over the series of the last 3 to 4 months where they're the ones up in front of their parents and residents talking about the neighborhood plan. I think it's like a plan like no other that I'm aware of, certainly in the city and maybe even the country in terms of, what we're doing. I think it's going to be a national model for how we engage youth in this process because there is such ownership by the youth that are living there and a commitment. And we're really proud of the work. We're going to be highlighting it tomorrow. This conversation, the Detroit Denmark Conversations, we're doing a panel conversation tomorrow at 1001 Woodward Avenue as part of Design Month and as part of Detroit Design 139, where we're going to be highlighting this project. So I encourage you all to come out and learn from the project manager, as well as we're going to have 3 amazing Danish speakers as well at that event. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it sounds, go, please.
Well, just a short thing, and from a design perspective, I think it's important that these spaces that are designed for schools and so on, and for kids and the youth, encourage to learn through play and to kind of to make your experiences and your reflections in a playful way, and that also encourage creativity, that you have spaces you wish for exploring
Open
and you get
spaces
triggered by, and that's both open spaces, that's school buildings and so on. I think that's where architecture also can kind of support them.
Yeah, I'm hearing a similar theme to transportation behind education, is we have to go back to probably maybe where we started and start to rethink these things, and this idea of having access to a school nearby and minimizing barriers to education, which, yes, technology can probably help to some degree, but there's probably some physical barriers that we need to remove, i.e. not taking 2 buses. Is there anything we can learn, Anne, from the great city of Copenhagen? I know this has been a priority for you all in terms of the egalitarian access to education. And
Yes, I think, thank you, Stefan, and very, very, very inspiring. As always, what I was thinking about when listening was that Denmark being a very, very digitalized country, if not the most digitalized, many syllables in that word, in Europe, the challenges we are trying to grapple with for the moment is exactly what Kathrin is saying, is how can we also have tech and education, which is already merged, so we don't need to do that now. But how can we make sure that makes the next generation more curious, more innovative, more critical, less asleep, less passive. We all know the downsides of tech and especially a young brain. But how can we make tech really work for that? Because our planet is facing so many challenges that we need the young people to be able to look at spaces, cities, relations in a totally different way. And there I think tech can play a crucial role. And that's really for tech being as ambitious as city planners are, as a country who are saying climate is going to be the national strategy. We need that kind of ambition, and we need to change the way we are doing things. So you saying again and again we have to go back and redo, I think that's really the motto.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things, and I would just love to go down the line, we're just going to lighten it up for a minute. Just lighten it up. Was I think that there's great challenges ahead of us, but I think there's also great accomplishments that have happened. And you and I were talking earlier, and Kathrin, about these spaces and the idea of access to public spaces that lift your spirits, right? You have a visceral response to Boart's architecture, whether you hate it or not, but there is a response and it conjures up something. And I'd love for all of us to think about, like, what is the one space, building, place in your town, country, city, park, what have you, that inspires you and you think that we need to continue to inspire the community, but also kind of bring us together, right? I'm going to jump in. My favorite's obviously in Detroit, the Guardian Building. I don't think you can walk into the Guardian Building and not have a connection to a higher energy and to all those that kind of came before you. It's also interesting because you see a bunch of other dumb people standing there with you like this, right? And that's really human, and we don't have that a lot anymore of just kind of coming together in those spaces. So I'd love to go on down the list and we'll lighten it up.
Yeah, I mean, in Copenhagen, there's also many of these, like, older buildings, like, for example, the Carlsberg Glyptotek and the main central station and the town hall that has that kind of inspiration. But if I'm thinking of something that is like a more recent and also a little bit old, that's actually just recently the Youth Island opened, which is an old sea fortress in front of the harbor of Copenhagen that was given to the scouts and like young people, where they can develop their own like kind of island with activities and social life and so on. And it's kind of it's them deciding, and it's a space they were given. Where there's a lot of exciting
Definitely
things going on.
my must-see list.
And you see Copenhagen from the harbor, which is also nice.
No, great example, Kathrin. I'm going to choose a very, very modest house. That's Danish too, that the great architect Finn Juhl built for himself. It's just outside Copenhagen. It's not a big house, but when you walk into it, you see that it has been designed in a way so subtly that wherever you are, you find light and beauty. And the fact that it's modest, the fact that it's small, is another way of saying that we human beings shouldn't always build cathedrals, or cathedrals are really beauty. And if we can do something like this in a small house that everybody, if you organize your society the right way, could actually have access to, then that's a revolution where beauty leads the way.
I love that. I have to come see that house.
Yes, you should.
I'm going to pick the Commons, which is a cafe, laundromat, community space on Detroit's east side on Mack Avenue. Last year they won our Commerce Design Awards. They worked with a local architecture firm called Lavu, and it's a Mack development corporation. It's a neighborhood-based group. And what I love about the Commons is that, it's beautiful, right? You walk in, it's beautiful, looks like any kind of coffee shop you would see anywhere. But it is designed with so much intentionality about it's at the crossroads of some very different neighborhoods. So the Indian Village neighborhood, neighborhoods to the north, West Village, neighborhoods to the east. And it's a place where everybody feels comfortable. You can come do your laundry there if you need to. You can come buy a cappuccino if you want to. You can work all day in their co-working space. You can drop your kids off for the after-school programs they have in the back and hang out, wait for them, and everybody is welcome. And that, to me, is the kind of epitome of what we need to be striving for as we invest in Detroit and develop the city.
Great answer.
Great.
That's a great space.
It's my job. My job to have great answers.
Well, since I'm last, I'm actually going to cheat and I'm going to give 2. Because
I can't control it from over here.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's off the rails.
I feel like push her off that.
So it's hard to just pick one. I think that the 2 spaces and buildings that really sort of inspire me here in Detroit, one it's the Fisher Building. It's beautiful architecture. Albert Kahn, you can really just feel the city's history in that building, and it's just amazing. And where it is today, you've got some great local retail, ground floor retail in the building. It's an amazing place to see a show. But I'm inspired every time I walk into that building, and I think about what Detroit was. I think about its past, present, and future, all in that building, and that's why I'm inspired, and it's really at the top of my list. Another building is Motown, the Motown, because it is I thought about you when you talk about it hasn't changed. I mean, you can go there from the outside and in the inside, and just feel the magic and the history of the music that endures to this day. But actually what I love about it is that it has not changed. And I think that it's this moment in time that really sort of captured Detroit. I know there's plans for a museum expansion, but what I love about that is that you really do feel transported when you go back, when you go into that building. You feel transported about the greatness, the legacy of Motown, and you feel it. You can't help but in that space feel almost what it was like to be there. And so I had to just add
Amazing.
that. Yeah.
Great. It's great. Amazing discussion. We've covered transportation, mobility, inclusion, and I think landing on this, and I took us there because I wanted to get back to inspiration and this idea that we all can be empowered and inspired via design, and that decision that we're making as architects or as planners, yes, it happens, but we as kind of citizens have this opportunity too. That being said, I think we've got a few more minutes if we want to open up to a question or two from the audience, or I have 1 or 2 more.
So the question that I have is, I've been super excited to see a lot of the changes towards kind of more people-oriented design in Detroit the past few years. And I'm a little worried that what's going to happen is there's going to be backlash against bike lanes. There's going to be backlash against people that hate that it's harder to find parking, which is inevitable. And there's going to be kind of a reversal of direction. And I think that the current administration has been enormously friendly towards these types of positive developments. I'm wondering, do any of you have kind of strategies towards making sure that to winning over hearts and minds and to build a more durable movement towards people?
Catherine's got it.
Because I think the experience in Copenhagen showed that many of these projects, they started as a test project. Suddenly, a bridge, one of the main bridges in the inner city, the traffic space was reduced, and they gave space for public space. And then people really took it to them and started to, use the space and come up with ways of using it that no planner ever could have imagined. And so I think a lot of it is kind of through this kind of testing and trying yourself to finding out what kind of amenity do we want to live in and how do we want to live city
So
life.
actually use the space once it's created or create the space yourself, right?
Yeah. And also in this weekend in Detroit, I've really seen super exciting projects that are these small experiments on how we work and live and have free time in the future in the city.
Yeah.
So.
We've been trying to get to the decision makers who fundamentally will, decide, right? Are we going to put money towards that? Why is this important? Because a lot of times the idea of design is, people don't always take it seriously. They think it's the kind of thing you slap on the end. They don't realize that it's really kind of the fundamental strategy that drives the project. And I think the question, the way that we've been trying to talk about, and I think can really hit it with bike lanes are about safety. Fundamentally, it's about making sure young men in Detroit don't get killed trying to get to school or work. And when you talk to whether it's business people or elected officials or whoever, it's trying to understand kind of what is motivating them, what would make it relevant to them, and trying to find that connection. And so there's a lot of partner projects that our community partners are working on are really framed in that way. Like what problem in Detroit is it really trying to tackle, and how does it do that?
And I would just echo what Olga said around really kind of the win-win. And really kind of what's speaking to people. It's also doing a deep level of community engagement and really sort of staying the course. And, I don't know any city that's won over everyone around, an initiative. But I think that when it's built and people start using it and actually seeing the benefits, I mean, that's the most, that's sort of the gateway drug is like just actually using it and kind of seeing, okay, it's something that is relevant to me. And again, transportation is really connecting people to where they live, to where they work, and providing options for them. So I think it's the value proposition, and I think it's squarely our responsibility to make that value proposition through meaningful engagement. And we have altered plans. We have changed what bike lanes look like through the community input process. We have slowed down projects because the community was not ready. And so I think we have to listen to the residents first and foremost, but I also think we have to continually be willing to engage in conversations, and hard conversations. They're not easy. I mean, trust me, I've been in a lot of community meetings, but I mean, being there, showing up, I mean, it does matter. And doing pilot demonstration projects where people can see, feel in touch what you're talking about is also really important to sustainability and moving forward.
All right.
Yeah. And if I can
close us out there.
Yeah, I will, and perhaps because you wanted to lighten the mood, perhaps come with an example how pushback is definitely a known entity in Denmark. When we started turning towards the climate, environmental policy, a political party appeared with one slogan: we have to defend the car owners. And it got many votes, which shows, and I think that goes for everything when you're talking about discourse. Don't make it a moral issue. Don't make people who think and believe and have lived well because of the car bad people. They're not. And don't make the people who are more hipster-like good people, because they're not either. Not even Danish hipsters. What you have to do is really understand that change is difficult, and you have to do it slowly, slower than my tempo would like, but you have to do it slowly, pragmatically, and respectfully.
That's right.
Otherwise, you will have enormous pushback. Pushback is inevitable. The party doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Anne. And thank you, our panelists. I mean, this idea that inclusivity isn't just inclusive for the group of people that you want to agree with. It should be inclusive to all is wonderful. We can't thank you enough for coming out, all of you, and we hope everyone will go to Detroit, Denmark conversations over the next 3 days? 3 different conversations the next...
Tomorrow
Tomorrow.
is the kickoff.
Is the kickoff.
5:30,
Okay.
1001 Woodward Avenue. Hope to see you there.
And thank you all 4 of you for everything you do to make our cities better places and ultimately communities better as well. So thank you, and thank you for coming.
And thank you.
Thank you
Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah.